following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Alan Blumkin, and I'm here today with my good friend David Nemic in another chapter of David Nemic's History and Trivia. Today we're going to be discussing the baseball relations in the major leagues from almost the beginning to what is going on now. Welcome, David.
Pleasure to be with you again, Al.
Yes, a long time coming.
It has been.
Since March, as a listing we did was in March. So, anyway, do you want to start off with the 19th century?
Well,
or you want me to?
With the reserve clause that, of course, has been in effect now for over 100 years, first went into effect after the 1879 season, and it was considered an honor. Every team could reserve 6 players, and it was considered an honor to be among the reserve players. And you were, of course, required to resign or sign with the team that reserved you. It was, in truth, not an honor at all, as players soon learned. And believe it or not, in the very first year the reserve clause went into effect, a player tested it. And that player was George Wright, who'd been playing under his brother Harry with Boston through the 1878 season. And Boston at that time was known for giving players multi-year contracts, because players at the end of a year, if they signed one-year contracts, were free to move on to another team. They were at liberty to go wherever they chose. So Boston would try to hold its players by giving them a 2 or 3 year contract, and thus, and requiring them to remain with the team for that long. George Wright's contract ran out at the end of 1878, and he immediately left his brother Harry with Boston team and signed with Providence in 1879, and Providence wound up beating Boston for the pennant. And Wright, who had been on the downswing at the time he left Boston, had a pretty good year with Providence and was among the players reserved for 1880. And Wright really wanted to go back to play with his brother in Boston and refused to rejoin the Providence team, and ended up sitting out most of the year, although he did play one game illegally with Boston toward the end of the season, and then ending up back with Boston in 1881 after he'd sat out the year. So Wright was really the first player to test the reserve clause, and players by the early 1880s the reserve clause increased each year. Number were beginning to realize that this was just forced, almost enslavement with to re-sign with the club that reserved them, and began to recognize it for what it was and to fight it. And Al, you of course know the story of John Montgomery Ward, and maybe you could pick it up there, because Ward really carried it through the rest of the 19th century.
First of all, before in the National Association, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they had free agency to an extent, because you couldn't hold players because there was no reserve clause. And so anyway, the inventor of the reserve clause was the owner of Boston. His name was Arthur Soden.
Arthur Soden, yeah.
Yeah. And first, as you said, they had 6 players, and then they wanted to extend it to everyone.
Pretty much by the early by the mid 1880s, every player was under, every player who was they wanted to keep was under reserve. I'm not sure how the numbers increased from year to year, but I know that by the mid 1880s they pretty well had everyone locked in, and the minor leagues too had a reserve. The minor leagues actually didn't have a reserve clause. Certain minor league players refused to be reserved, and we can get into that as we go on a bit further with our story.
Okay. Yeah. John Montgomery Ward was a multi-position ball player. He pitched the second perfect game of all time in the 1880s, and then he became a shortstop. This is with the Giants, and by that time, especially probably after the folding of the Union Association, the owners of the National League and the American Association decided that they would quash salaries. And then they put in 1888, they put in a clause for personal habits. Am I right there?
Yeah.
So Montgomery Ward went on a tour of Europe and a couple other countries that were outside.
The world tour.
Yes.
After the 1888 season, they went to Australia. They went. They saw the pyramids. They really covered almost.
I have a book somewhere on that. Yeah. And then when Ward, who was the de facto president of the Players Association, such as it was, when he went on this world tour, that's when the owners decided to implement the behavioral clause and the fact that they were going to pay X amount to whatever some positions, and not budge from it, and the player who was reserved obviously couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah, let me just the key to it was an owner named John T. Brush, who put in a rating system, rating players A through F, and if you were an A player, you can make the top salary, which I think was $3,000, and it dropped down $250 for every grade you dropped down. I think the lowest rank was an F, and Ward was, as Al was saying, was absent during this time. Had no idea what was going on because there was no communication among the players who were on the tour and what was going back in the United States. No, there were no forms of communication possible, of course, during the 19th century. So Al is right in saying that, in Ward's absence, the owners really jumped in and took advantage. And
in 1890, with the existence of the Players League, an awful lot of players, I think especially from the National League, jumped to the Players League. And on that folded after 1 year, they went back to their clubs with a couple of exceptions. Bierbaum, I think, was the one who was supposed to go on to Philly, went to Pittsburgh. That's how Pittsburgh got the nickname the Pirates. But after the American Association was absorbed by the National League in 1892, they really went out suppressing. And the first time that there was any competition at that point was when the American League came in 1901, and they raided very, very many National League players, and the two biggest owners that left got raided were Arthur Snowden. I think his name was John Rogers with the Phillies.
Right.
Yeah, they lost almost everybody because of the way they treated the higher hands. and then salaries went up because there was competition. And once the peace was signed in 1903, the owners went back to suppressing salaries.
Yeah, and they honored each each league honored the other league's contracts, and there have been players jumping back and forth between 1901 and 1903, pretty much at will, and that ended. Although George Davis tried to jump back from Chicago to the American League team to the Giants, and ended up being pretty much banned for the year, lost a whole year out of his career, and that year cost him dearly because he didn't make the He is a Hall of Fame player, and didn't make the Hall of Fame till really just in the past 20 some years or so. He should have made it way back when, but so he was the last real jumper between the two leagues in 1903, and then, as Al was saying, the players fell into lockstep. They were back to the old reserve clause, and there was really nothing they could do. There were early attempts to form unions. Chief Zimmer, major league catcher and very influential figure among other players, tried to form a union. Had support in the early part of the 20th century. Couldn't get it off the ground. The idea of unionizing was unpopular among players. Former player turned lawyer Dave Fultz picked it up and tried to form a union. Later on, that too fell apart, and players for most of the time between the mid-teens and fairly not that long ago, really, if you look back over history, were chattels, were bound by the reserve clause, and were not members of unions. Although there was an attempt to form one in 1946, right after the war. I believe it was led by Tony Lupian, a first baseman who was being shuffled back to the minors and refused to go, and tried to test the reserve clause and tried to get other players to back him. But that ended up going nowhere. And individual players were left to try to struggle with the reserve clause on their own. But
didn't judges who were hearing these cases say it was up to Congress?
Yeah, they said baseball was a sport, was not really a business.
Yeah.
So it wasn't bound by the same laws as businesses, corporations, or whatever were bound by. So they kept throwing these cases out, and they went on into the 50s. Individual players stuck in minor league systems tried to fight it and ended up getting nowhere. There was a pitcher with the Cubs chain in the 1940s during the war year named Boyd Tepler, who was a tremendous prospect, really a phenomenal left-hander, high strikeouts ratios, very, very low hits surrendered in the Southern League. And in 1944, hurt his elbow and was forced back into action too early and ended up ruining him. And he was stuck in the Cubs system. The Cubs thought he was jaking it, meaning that he was faking his injury and to get out of their contract with being bound by them and trying to become a free agent and a bonus baby. But really, Tepler was hurt and fought it and ended up writing a book called In Cub Chains, which is very hard to find today, but a book well worth reading if ever you can get a hold of a copy. And beyond that, we go to fairly modern times. And Al, you want to pick it up probably with what Curt Flood,
Well, first of all, let me say, I think Delahanty was preparing to jump back to the National League from Washington when he got killed. And second of all, the next time that players had an opportunity, was the 2 years of the Federal League, 1914 and 1915.
That's a good point.
And I know that Walter Johnson was prime one and some others to jump their teams and go play the Federal League. So they were given for that period very big multi-year contracts. And one of then the American League, the Federal League folded after 1950, and they went back to the old reserve clause. And one of the sidebars of that is that one of the reasons the Black Sox scandal happened is because the two ringleaders, Chick Yandel and Sweet Risberg, hated Eddie Collins, who was playing second. Collins brought over a sizable contract from the Philadelphia A's. He was making more than some of these guys would see in 3 years. So I think that was one of the triggers for the Black Sox scandal. Okay, in 1946, coming back from the war, a guy, I think his name was Murphy.
He was Murphy. Yeah, Murphy was affiliated with the Lupian.
And the reason for the Lupian situation is that it was promised that all people could go back to their original employment and be on a team in baseball, football, whatever. And Lupian, just as soon as he was supposed to go, he thought he was going to the Phillies. It was dissatisfied with their offer. He said they're supposed to keep him on the roster for a year, and we went to the Pacific Coast League. So this was one where they brought it up, and I think they said that sports teams were not affected by the
Al?
Yeah.
You're breaking up. I can't hear you.
Sorry. My voice is low. Can you hear me now?
Barely. No, I can't hear you. Maybe I should try to call back and get on. Yeah, I can't hear you at all. Al? I'll call back and try and get on that way. Al?
Yeah.
Okay, we're back.
Okay. So anyway, in 1946, these people attempted to form a union, and there were certain teams that voted very heavily against it, so it really never got off the ground. And then I don't think they made another try until the early 50s, which was the forerunner of the current Players Association. And I know Allie Reynolds was one of the leaders, Bob Fellow, Ralph Kiner, and but nothing really happened until the Players Union brought in Marvin Miller. And Robin Roberts was the one who brought him in. And he discusses this. He came out with a autobiography a number of years ago, and the last chapter is devoted to the Players Association. And he brought in Marvin Miller, and that ended his chances to get some sort of major league job after that. But and Marvin Miller, in I think it was 1950s or early 60s, negotiated the first collective bargaining agreement, and so Miller was having them, the owners, act as equals, not superiors, and it went along, and then players were complaining about the reserve clause. As you mentioned, Curt Flood, who was traded from the Cardinals to the Phillies after a dozen years with the Cardinals, refused to report. He says nothing against the Phillies, but he felt that he compared himself to a well-paid slave. And then he brought a suit against Major League Baseball. And the reserve clause, and the judges, Supreme Court justices, deny it like a 5-3 or 5-4 vote. And Flood went over to Denmark for a year, and then he came back with the expansion senators, and he did not do well. Apparently he'd lost all the skills from sitting that 1 year out in 1970. But this provided the impetus because in the next, I think it was the next bargaining agreement, CBA, is that the owners put in a 10 and 5 clause, which means any player had 10 years in and 5 with the team he was on could veto a trade. And some of them did that.
Yeah.
But so it started to create a new era in owners-players relationships. And Marvin Miller came up with the idea soon after the Flood case to challenge the reserve clause. And he got a number of players promising to sign not to sign contracts with the team they were on. Most of them signed early. And finally, got Andy Messersmith, who was a Dodger ace at that point, and Dave McNally, who was on the way to retirement. And they sued, saying the reserve clause said 1 year and an option, and then I think it was 1 year, and then they became free agents. And the owners, of course, went to court on this, and finally was decided by an arbitrator, Peter Seitz. He was part of the arbitration board with the owners and players, and he voted that 1 year meant 1 year. And after he made that ruling, the owners fired him. But Miller had them, ground them down, and he was by then the most effective Players Association leader there ever was. So the first time in 1976, 24 players went to free agency. Most famous, of course, was Reggie Jackson, who left the Orioles to go to the Yankees for $3 million over 5 years. And Bobby Rich was another one. Dave Cash was another one. And the worst case was Wayne Garland, who was coming off a 20-win season with the Orioles and went to the Indians for $250,000 a year for 10 years.
Yeah,
and he hurt his arm right away.
I'm from Cleveland, and you had to remind me. Yeah, that was a horrible, misfortune on Cleveland's part. That showed how the reserve clause really could whiplash against, free agency could really whiplash against
especially pitchers.
Yeah, especially pitchers.
In fact, Peter Gollenbach wrote a book a number of years ago called The Forever Boys. It's about those leagues in Florida with these senior ball players, ones who aren't active in the major leagues anymore. And Garland was one of them. And Garland hurt his arm again in the senior league. But and then as it grew and grew and grew, the frenzy got crazier and crazier. And there's a lot of misjudgments by the owners in signing some of these guys to big multi-year contracts. And when the old days, when they played World Series, and the players would get $8,000 apiece for winning it, was chump change compared to what it's become. Okay, and the rocky relationship between Miller and the owners came to a head in 1980 because the owners wanted a CBA or whatever clauses were in there, and the players refused, and there's going to be a strike in 1980, and they both agreed that they play and the negotiations would go on. They postponed it for a year. Then, as we all know, in 1981, they went on strike. Players went on strike, and cost baseball, I think it was 2 months.
A little part of the season.
Yeah, in the schedule, yeah. And when they came back, it was an all-star game.
Yeah.
Before anything resumed. And of course, the brilliant Bowie Kuhn suggested that there be a first half winner and a second half winner. So Cincinnati had the best overall record that season, and since they didn't win either time, they weren't allowed to claim the pennant. And what happened, because of the playoff system then, they expanded it to include division series. So you had division series, league championship series, and World Series. Of course, this is what they implemented in 1994.
Yeah.
But it threw a lot of people off. And there was basically some sort of labor peace until the 1990s, when the players in the 1994 season, which was turning into a very rapid, terrific pennant races, because that's 1994, they'd split the leagues into 3 divisions. And they introduced the wild card. So, the postseason would consist permanently with the division series, the LCS, and the World Series. But the players struck in August 1994. I also should mention there was a 2-day stoppage in 1985. And in 1990, the season started a week or 2 late, but they played a full season because they made up with double headers and open dates and all of this. But it was just steps that were. You followed the steps they were coming to a head. So in 1994, they struck in August. Players, and most people thought that they would come back in time for a World Series or playoffs. Didn't happen. So you go to the Hall of Fame, and the list pennant winners, World Series winners for 1994, there's nothing. And so what happened in 1995, that strike was still continuing, and Judge Sonia Sotomayor, who's now on the Supreme Court, ruled in favor of the players. So they opened the season in 1995, and each team played 18 less games.
Yeah,
they played 144.
Yeah,
I forgot.
4-game season.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that there was a strike or a lockout in 1972, which ended after 2 weeks at the start of the season, and the teams were not going to didn't have to make up games lost. So in the American League East, Detroit beat the Red Sox out by half a game.
Yeah.
So there's been these kinds of things, strikes and lockouts, and so.
If I could comment on the 95, how the strike continued into 95. The owners were not at all sure that the players were going to come back. And it wasn't, as Al said, it wasn't until the Supreme Court intervened, or not the Supreme Court, but Sotomayor intervened that they did. And teams as a result were holding tryouts in the spring of 95. They were going to assemble a kind of a wildcat team and wildcat umpires, and they were going to conduct the season. They were determined to go ahead, and as a result, I got to actually try out for a major league team, even though I was in my 50s. And there was a tryout in San Francisco. I went to it, and the scout who was there from the Pirates actually took two players aside, both pitchers who had not played professional baseball for several years, were playing in the men's senior league in the San Francisco Bay Area, and signed them to contracts right there on the spot. Whatever happened to them, I don't know. And I never saw either one pitch in the majors after that. But they were signing players just in the event the strike continued on into the 95 season and wasn't settled. And they were determined to go ahead and stage a season of one kind or another. It would have been like what year was the NFL staged a strike in 1987?
Yeah.
And
82 and 87, yeah.
They brought in wildcat players out of nowhere, and those games counted. And I think the same thing would have happened in 95 if they had started the season with
in baseball they called it
players.
In baseball they called it replacements players.
Yeah.
And the ones who were able to stick around for a year or more were never allowed to join the players union.
Yeah. Yeah, and the same with
they were considered scabs,
Yeah. Yeah.
And there was peace, relative peace most of the time, until recently with the CBA process seemed to be smoothed out. And then when you come to this year, 2020, the two sides are philosophically are as far apart as you can get. And while people were clamoring for baseball this year as something to take their minds off the coronavirus, the two sides have been at each other's throats. MLB makes a proposal. Players turn it down. Players make a proposal. The owners turn it down. Now they're saying it looks like there's going to be a 60-game season. and with extended playoffs. What are you going to do? You could, in late October, November, you could have games in Minnesota or here in New York or in Boston, Philly, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, any of the northeast cities or Midwest North. They're going to play. They're going to play postseason games in these places where it's going to be freezing.
Yeah, it's my instinct is that we're not going to have a season in 2020. For the first time since 1870, there will be no professional baseball season.
The fact that if there's nothing, and if they play a full year next year, they're going to think the fans are going to come back in droves. A lot of fans feel totally offended by this, and some have been quoted saying they will spend a dime in a ballpark to make the owners richer.
Yeah, or the players.
And I think what has happened this year, the current CBA runs out after 2021. If you think these negotiations are tough, those are going to be, as far as I can see, brutal.
Yeah.
And it's really, really a sad state. I know Bill Terry once said years ago, says the game has to be great to that the owners can't ruin it. Yeah. That's not direct, but it's something like that.
Yeah. It's,
So, as we've discussed, the labor relations between MLB and the players have always been up and down. There's never a free ride or a free, agreement on everything. And their history is, in recent years, is not. They haven't really learned anything.
No,
and one of the outcomes of this is that people will blame the players because the players are visible. I mean, you or I could walk into a meeting of the ferry owners, we couldn't recognize who was who.
No, we couldn't. And and even before all this happened, of course, attendance had been on the downswing for over a decade, and baseball is no longer the national pastime. It's no longer the most popular professional sport. The NFL is way ahead of it in popularity. I think the NBA has superseded it too.
The NBA.
And it's baseball is a lame third place at best. And after this year, I don't know. The recovery period is going to be lengthy, and the patient is questionable, is marginal.
There's a couple of things I forgot to mention. When the owners had the upper hand from after the Federal League collapse until the arbitrator's decision creating free agents in 1975, there were two particular periods that the owners really crushed them, players. In 1930s, player would hold out or ask for more money. They tell the player, well, you could be on the breadlines. But during the Depression.
Yeah.
And then in the 40s, if any of the replacement players from the war, because everybody was in the Army back then, made us think about something. He says, don't warn him not to do it because he could wind up in the Army for $50 a month.
Yeah, and even after the war, baseball really boomed in the mid 40s, 46, 47, 48. The minor leagues were enormous. I think that one year they had over 50 leagues, and there were really tremendous number of very good players stuck in the minors, ready to take over any job available. So the players really had very little bargaining power for a long period of time. They didn't start making a $5,000 minimum salary until the 1950s, and the average player now makes more than an entire team made in the 1950s, and things have changed dramatically in the last half a century. But it remains to be seen what's going to happen. Baseball is definitely on its path to recovery is going to be a difficult and torturous one, I think.
Well, yeah, I think the negotiations on the next CBA are going to be very, very acrimonious. 1995, they got lucky because everybody started focusing on the Cal Ripken consecutive game streak. And that helped bring it back a little. But, it's really a shame. The owners don't know how to market it. And they don't have, they're all billionaires who have other interests. It's not like the old days with Connie Mack and Clark Griffith and Stoneham in the National League, who basically the team was their only asset.
Yeah, there were owners who depended on the team for their livelihood, absolutely. And that's not true anymore.
No. The last owner that they forced out was Frank McCourt for the Dodgers, because the Dodger fans were boycotting games, and they wouldn't come back as long as he owns them, and they forced them out. And they got a new ownership, and then the fans came back. But that's the only time I can recall that happening was in 1943, when the owner of the Phillies, William Cox, not the third baseman for the Dodgers in that era, in 1943 he started betting on games, and he was caught.
Supposedly for betting on his own team, which was stellar finisher year after year. It's rather hard to believe, but there was no one ever to contradict it.
But it's, as we've discussed, it's a torturous and eventful history, and I think that because all people are wondering how the whole thing works. I think you and I have just given a course in this, and I hope people listen to it.
Yeah, it's an education. It really is an education. Labor relations in baseball. It's going back to the early times. It's players at first thought it was a privilege to play for their team, and they quickly grew to realize that they were chattels. And it was a long time before they could break free of the chains. And the Players League in 1890 was player-run, player-directed. The owners weren't players; they were friends of players and chosen by players often. And the National League owner, Al Spalding, finessed the Players League out of existence, unfortunately, because if that league had lasted 2 or 3 years, the course of baseball would have changed dramatically right then and there. Who knows what it would have turned into? But we might not be where we are today. And today is as Alice said, today is a very difficult position for both the players and the owners and, of course, the fans. The fans most of all, because People really, really count on Major League Baseball. It's one of the few constants in history for the last 150 years. And now it's definitely in danger.
Yeah, and the fans, after this fiasco that's going on now, are going to say, why should I give a dime to the owners? And they feel betrayed. The whole thing with the pandemic is that it's a public perception that these greedy people, both owners and players, the only thing they care about is money and beating each other up. It's a sad case, and I think that a lot of fans resent this, and they're not going to go to the ballpark to pay the exorbitant prices to see a game. And I'll be surprised if Major League Baseball, if they have a full season next year, doesn't decline in attendance.
Yeah, but it's actually up in the air for all major sports. I know the NBA and NFL think they're going to play, and the NHL is making a stab at it too. After early results and people who are players who are testing positive for COVID, and in tennis likewise. There's in the paper today I was reading about Djokovic holding an exhibition tour, and players are testing positive. And
Djokovic is number one right now, tested positive.
Yeah, I know, and it's it throws the whole rest of the tennis season. The Open and U.S. Open and French are still on to be played. I think it's very, very doubtful that either one will, and I think it's doubtful the NBA will resume, or we're going to have an NFL season. I think it's very unlikely.
Well, I think the lesser players would play. You wouldn't have Federer's out with he just had surgery on a knee, but so you've got Djokovic and Nadal. If they don't play because of the restrictions, so like to have one person accommodate them, then it's open. The whole tournament is opened up.
Yeah.
But tennis is also a sport of where the top players have a lot of profile and a lot of say, and if they don't show up, people are going to say, "Who cares?"
Well, they're probably not going to be able to have spectators anyway at these Open.
We're playing golf right now with no spectators.
Yeah, with no spectators. And the NASCAR is going on. They did have the Belmont Stakes with no spectators.
Yeah, I know. I watched that the other day.
That had to be really surreal. I didn't watch it, but
the horse. What I wanted to Tiz Law. If it had been a mile and a half, he would have won by 15 lengths.
Yeah.
But in Saratoga, they have the Travis Stakes in the middle of the meet up there, and horses were running that before the Kentucky Derby and Preakness. Yeah, it's so whacked out, so out of order that what can you do? The coronavirus is doing things that the world wars couldn't end. With ball games. I mean, in the World War II, they had a lot of players who were just up there for the 3 years, but there was still baseball.
And there was NFL football too, and hockey, NHL.
Now there were only 6 teams back then.
Yeah.
And almost all the players were Canadian.
Yeah. So sports have continued. Really, professional sports have continued despite world wars and strikes and all kinds of other catastrophes. But definitely the pandemic has put a wrinkle in that no one has been able to, work around. It may be a long time before we can, and resume anything close to normality. And college sports the same way. I really think it's foolish for college teams to think they're going to hold a football season this year. And you're talking about 19, 20, 21-year-old kids, and these, I don't know. These are kids that are really most susceptible now to getting the virus if they don't pay attention to all the distancing and masks and so forth. So
somebody asked me if anything positive came out of this whole baseball situation. I say it is one. The Pirates can't lose 100 games.
Yeah.
But look, it's what it is. They're going to have disputes about service time and who becomes a free agent. You got a situation where Mookie Betts went from the Red Sox to the Dodgers, and if they say it, that time counts to free agency, he's going to go somewhere else, and the Dodgers would have had him, and they never got a nickel out of him.
Yeah, never wore the uniform in a single game.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff involved in the CBA process, and we just have to wait. Okay, David?
Yeah.
This was terrific. I think you taught me, and I taught you, and hopefully, this program will get an audience.
I hope so, yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Al, once again.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming on, and we'll talk soon.
Good.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Be safe.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.